My name's Michelle Underwood, and I'm the Coast Guard's SAPR Program Manager, and I'm inviting you to a storyteller session. When somebody shares their story, it's a form of narrative therapy. When we work with victims that have been traumatized, any form of trauma, it's initially difficult to revisit the trauma, and so trauma victims usually start with what we call their G version of the story. It's the safest version to tell yourself. Then that story oftentimes will grow into the PG version of the story, PG-13 version of the story, and sometimes the R and the X-rated version of the story. Be mindful that the content that you're going to hear today from our storyteller is graphic in nature, and it's a real lived experience. Should you decide that you would like to explore narrating your story, there's a host of helping professionals in the Coast Guard that can do that with you. Should you decide that you would like to share your story with a helping professional in the Coast Guard, remember, any one of the helping professionals can maintain your confidentiality and get you the help that you need so that you can stay viable in your relationships and viable in your job. Without further ado, I welcome you to Storytellers.
Hi, my name is Meghan Klement. I live in Eastern Oregon with my husband of 11 years and 3 sons, and I live on a small farm and run a business. But back in 2012 is when I entered the Coast Guard. I came from a really small town in Southwest Washington in a home that my dad built. I had 3 older brothers, or have, and my dad worked for the city as a firefighter for 35 years, and my mom retired from the VA hospital. I spent many years visiting my mom at work, going to work with her, and spending a lot of time with veterans. The pride that I saw in these people was something that I wanted to find in myself. My dad served and my brother served. They were both in the Navy, and the sense of pride that I saw in my home and the love for our country really formed me into being somebody who wanted to be in the Coast Guard. I initially was going to join the Navy, and my dad said to me, I would really like it if my only daughter went in the Coast Guard because I feel like you're going to be safer there. I don't want her going overseas. So I agreed, and I said, okay, I'm going to join the Coast Guard. In 2012, I went to boot camp, and it was a very awesome experience for me. Some of my buddies from boot camp are still my best friends today and continue to be top supporters in my life. And they stood by me through my whole Coast Guard experience. I went to boot camp, and out of boot camp, I got stationed at a small boat station, Nia Bay, which, if you don't know, is an isolated unit on an Indian reservation up on the peninsula in Washington. I was there for a few months, and every time after I went underway, my knees started swelling, and we couldn't figure out why. So one afternoon I got called into my warrant officer's office, and she acted very friendly to me, like we were friends, and said, you know, we think it's a really good idea that we station you at Air Station Port Angeles, because then you can go to physical therapy easier and have easier access, because I was driving 2 hours in each direction to go to an appointment. She said, you know, do you want to be in the Coast Guard? Is that something that you want to do? And I said, yes, ma'am, that's what I want to do. This is where I want to be. I was very embarrassed and very ashamed that I was having issues, because I knew that if I was a broken tool, I wasn't a tool that they could use. It doesn't make you very popular So I trusted her, and I went to Port Angeles. I was set to marry my husband, and so that's kind of another agreement that they had. Well, you can get married to your husband and move out of the barracks. Right when I get stationed there, I get married to my husband, and I think I met the person who continued to assault me over the next 3 or 4 months, the first day that I arrived. And he was very kind. He was so nice to me. He was a retired senior chief who was then contracted with the Coast Guard. He was my father's age. So I thought that he was just, seeing a young girl and kind of taking her under his wing. About 3 days after I arrived at the air station, I got called into a commander's office with a lieutenant commander and a master chief, and they slid a memorandum across the desk that said intent to discharge for fraudulent enlistment for abnormal flat feet. I was 19. I had never lived anywhere other than the home that my dad built. I didn't know any better, but I did know that I wasn't a liar, and there was no way that I had lied to get into the Coast Guard. So I went back to my shop, and I went to my SK2, who was like became a big sister to me, and I told her what was going on, and my warrant in that shop had pulled me aside and said, "You can trust me with anything. I'm here to support you. I'm here to help you," because they had said to me, "You go home tonight, read this over. We'll have you in tomorrow. You can sign it. We'll have you out in 30 days. My warrant's telling me, "I'm here to support you. Any questions, any concerns, you can talk to me." My SK2, my friend, she said, "There's somebody I need you to meet." He was a chief that was in our shop who was screwed over by the same command. So there was an underground group of us that were all kind of aware of what was happening. So I went up and I met with this chief, and I told him what was going on, and he looked at me and he said, "Are you a liar?" And I said, "No, Chief, I'm not." He goes, "Are you lying?" I said, "No, Chief, I'm not a liar. I didn't lie." And he goes, "Then I'm going to help you." He gave me a number to a JAG. I had to call and hire a JAG, and then I called my dad. What they don't tell you is that you can hire a congressman when you feel like your rights are being infringed. My JAG was able to prove that in my MEPS paperwork it said fit for full duty, abnormal flat feet. I found out later from my HS friend that there was a SK lieutenant commander going into my paperwork in the clinic, searching, trying to find something. So I hired a congressman. The congressman called headquarters, said, "We heard you're trying to kick one of your members out under false pretenses. If you continue to go forward with this, we're going to make it public." The Coast Guard dropped it. Nobody told me, but I did know that I wasn't liked. Here I am. I'm an issue. I've been in the Coast Guard for all of 4 or 5 months. And all during this time, I am being assaulted at work by an older man who had served his 20 years and then continued to work for the Coast Guard. He was the IT guy, so anytime that my profile would go down, my first class, who was his bowling buddy, would send me to his office to get it fixed. And looking back, my profile went down quite a bit, and I didn't think anything of it. But it was down a hallway, and he was in a room with no windows. You'd walk in, and there was a desk facing the door. The door had blinds on it, and he would keep them closed. I would walk in, and I grew up with men in my life who respected women. So that meant you never closed the door when you were alone in an office with a woman. I would go to his office, and when I would walk in, his desk was facing the door, and there would be a desk in the corner where you would go onto your profile, and he would help you fix it and walk through it with you. He would he would close the door, and I would sit at the desk and sign into my profile. And as he was helping me, he would touch me. And he would run his hands up my legs, up my thighs. He would touch my lower back. And he would just tell me how beautiful I was and how cute I was. And I would be, when it was time to leave, he would get up from his desk and he would position himself between me and the door. And he would make me hug him. Before I could leave his office, he said, "Well, you have to give me a good hug for helping you." And he would hug me and run his hands all over my body. And he would continue to do that for months. And it was little things here and there. He would, after I'd leave his office, he would make sure to walk me back to my office like a gentleman would. He would walk me out the back door because I know, being in IT, he knew where all the cameras were, he knew where everything was, and he would walk me back to my shop. And place his hands on my lower back. And he just was always touching me any chance he got when he felt like nobody could see him. And at the same time, I was having my fraudulent enlistment stuff going on. And when my warrant got word that my case had been dropped, and he didn't know about it, and I was sitting there knowing this information, I didn't trust him. I didn't trust the games he was trying to play with me, and I could see through it. But I think he saw me as a naive young girl who would unknowingly just trust him because of his rank. He felt really stupid when he found out that my case had been dropped and he was unaware. So he came into the shop, and we were in a circle in a warehouse. So everybody was there. We could all look into the center. He came up to my desk and slammed his fist down on my desk and called me a stupid little girl. That what they were doing wasn't even a big deal, and if I would have just told him, he would have told me that. And that is when I realized that everybody in charge of me had ulterior motives, and I had to learn to play this game and be 2 steps ahead of them at all times. And I continued to live that way for my entire Coast Guard career. The man who was assaulting me and harassing me would come into my shop, and everybody was around in a circle, so everybody was right there and could see. But he would come up behind me and place his hands on my chair and lean over like he's helping me on the computer. And he would whisper the most perverted things about my body and me. And I would look around at everybody in my shop going about their business, not even questioning it. He would tell me, I saw you yesterday in your uniform. I didn't know you had such an amazing body under your uniform. You are just so beautiful. And it chipped away at me because I was newly married and I was 19 years old. I did not want to accept the things that were happening. I felt as if I didn't have anybody to go to. But I had gone to my SK3, and he's an awesome guy. Because at the same time, I was also I was getting sexually harassed over text messages from my BM1 at my prior unit, and I was at TDY orders at PA, and they were talking about sending me back to the unit. This man had been moved from being BM1 at Station PA because he was sleeping with his non-rates. And so what they did with him, their solution was to move him out to the isolated Nia Bay, where I had worked underneath him. He was trying to get me over to his house to have drinks with him. And he ended up sending me a picture of a coupon that said, for one instance of you saying something perverted to me, that I'm not going to report to HR. And I was friends with his wife, his new wife, his non-rate he cheated on his wife with. And I just pretended like none of this was happening because I didn't have anybody to go to. And I went to my SK3, and I would ask people questions. Well, what do you think about this person? Like, they're pretty friendly, and that's just who they are. That's just who they are. I wouldn't worry about it. It's not a big deal. I heard that so many times. I ended up going to my SK3, and I showed him the text messages I had been receiving. And he just didn't have the training then to properly know how to handle the situation. So he went straight to my BM1 and his wife. And they started sending me text messages about how disgusting I was, how gross of a person I was, and that he would never be interested in a disgusting girl like me. And I would just receive these long text messages, and my husband was traveling for work, and I was alone. And I would go home, and I would be alone, and I would lock my doors and close my blinds because these people knew where I lived. And I'd gone to my SK3, and he'd sold me out. I then went to my SK1, and I told her, I'm really worried about going back to Nia Bay. I don't feel safe going back there. I don't feel like it would be a good environment. And she goes, okay, well, let's go have a conversation with the XO. Oh, I went to my XO's office with her, and she was sitting there like she was supporting me. And I looked at my XO and I said, I'm really scared to go back to Nia Bay. I don't feel safe. I just don't feel like it's going to be a good place to go. And he looked at me and he said, I'm here to give you a reality check. And if Nia Bay needs your support, then Nia Bay is where you're going to go. And I said, yes, sir. And I walked out, and I remember walking down that hallway just, who am I supposed to go to? Who's going to help me? All these people were supposed to help me. It wasn't until we went out to lunch for somebody's birthday that somebody saw what was happening. We went to a restaurant in town, and we sat and had lunch, and my awesome MK2 cool, the coolest dude, he saw it. He saw the interest that this man had in me. He would laugh at everything I would say, and he was just a little too interested. And so when we got back to my shop, MK called me back to his desk and he said, "What's going on?" And I said, Nothing." He said, "No, you're gonna tell me what's going on." And so I told him what had been happening over the last 3 months. He said, "Okay, you go back to work. I'm going to take care of this." I showed up to work the next morning, and my warrant officer, who did not like me, said, "Klement, let me see you out back." He had a teacup in his hand with a tea bag in it. And he brought me out behind the building and went around the side where nobody could see us. And he said, "Did so-and-so shut his office door with you in it and position himself between you and the door?" I said, "Yes, sir, that happened. This has been going on." And I pulled my phone out and I showed him the text messages and I said, "This is also going on." And he twirled his little tea bag and he said, "Okay, before you go ahead and tell anybody else about this, I want you to think about these men and their lives and how they could lose their jobs over this. And then CJIS is going to show up and they're going to make you out to be a liar. Do you want that to happen? Because nobody's going to believe you." And I said, "Well, no, sir, I don't want that to happen." And he goes, "So I want you to go in there and I want you to think about this before you ever tell anybody else." And he walked back inside with his stupid cup of tea and went about his business. And I walked in and I just stood there and I looked over and my friend Elizabeth said, "What just happened?" And I told her and she said, "Oh, hell no." And she brought me out of my shop and into the YN shop to a female chief. And we went into a locker room and we sat on the floor and I started to tell her everything that had happened to me. And she held me while I cried because I think at that moment I had finally realized what had been happening to me and what was going on and how big of a deal it was. And when I said the man's name, her face went pale. And I said, "Well, what?" And she said, "He tried doing the same thing to me." Go and find out that he'd been trying with many women all over base. I was just the first one to ever say anything. The next day, Coast Guard Investigative Services showed up. They gave me a half an hour to write a report by myself. And then they took me up into a room, and that female chief, she came with me, and they began their investigation. And they made me show them every place that he touched me and how he did. And then I said, "You know, he tried the same thing with her." And then she got in trouble because she didn't report it. I wasn't mad at her. I still am not mad at her. She probably didn't think much of it because it's the kind of culture that we had constantly dealt with. So I'm looking at her getting reprimanded by these CJIS agents and feeling so much guilt, like, oh, I just said something else I wasn't supposed to say. And now the only person who's helping me is now getting reprimanded. It was sick. It turns out those CJIS agents decided that I wasn't actually assaulted and that I was only harassed. Nobody moved me from my base, and they kept me working there. My first class and my warrant were buddies with the person who had assaulted me, so he came in to visit them all the time, and I had have to sit there. And he would look at me, and he would look down his nose at me and shake his head. Every time I saw him outside, he'd stand there like he was disgusted with me. The BM1, when he was on base, I don't, if you've ever been to Port Angeles, it's on a long spit. So I had come out of the clinic one day and he was in the parking lot and there was one sidewalk. He stood there right on the other side of the curb and I had to walk by him. And he stood there with his arms crossed and he shook his head like he was disgusted with me. And as I passed, he spit on the sidewalk. And that was the minute where I realized that I was the only person who was going to advocate for me. And I marched right into the chief's office and I said, you either get me out of the fucking Coast Guard or you send me back home. She said, go back to your desk. I'll call you in a little bit. An hour later, I get a phone call from her. Portland's close to home, right? I said, yeah, Chief. She said, all right, when do you want your last day to be? I said, I want it to be tomorrow. They cut me orders like that. It's possible. And I called my husband that night and I said, honey, you need to come home, we're moving. The following week, I reported in Portland. Nobody knew I was coming. I showed up in my trops and I was in the locker room changing into ODUs and another non-rate came in and she sits down and she looks at me and she goes, who are you? And I said, well, what do you mean? And she goes, are you Segis? I go, no. She goes, nobody knew that you were coming and you're just really squared away, so we thought that you might be Segis. I'm like, I am not Segis. But yeah, I'm working here now. So nobody knew I was coming, so I was automatically just this, like, stuck out like a sore thumb. I don't think people knew, but I think everybody started to assume, because that just doesn't, you just don't have people show up out of the middle of nowhere and for no reason. So people were afraid to talk to me. As soon as I got there, they stuck me back into a comms room with one door. And it was in the corner. There was no way for me to escape. And people would just come in and I was backed into a corner. So I was having issues. So I had gone to my chief and I was like, I can't work in the environment anymore. I just can't do it right now. And they weren't happy with that because they weren't able to use me in the way that they wanted to. So I showed up to work one of the days and they said, we're going to send you up to Bremerton to the Naval Hospital for a psych eval. Because I wasn't getting better in the time frame. In my 10 days of house hunting that they gave me, they told me I could take the full 10 days to decompress and recollect myself and come back to work. And when I came back and I still wasn't better, they decided that I was probably nuts. They told me that this BM1 that I had no idea who she was going to escort me up there. And I said, no way, I'll have my husband drive me. And she said, okay, she'll be waiting at the doors to escort you to your appointment to make sure that you go. And I said, okay. So I go up, I drive 3.5 hours to this appointment. I sit down with a psychiatrist. She goes, why are you here? And I said, well, I was assaulted at work. And when they move me units, they're trying to put me back into the same environment that I was assaulted in. And she slammed her book shut and she said, this is a waste of my time. There is nothing wrong with you. This is exactly what I would expect from somebody who'd been through what you had been through. And she's like, I wasn't in her office for more than 5 minutes. That was where I started to see, like, it's okay for me to feel the way that I feel in this environment. That doesn't mean that there's anything super wrong with me. Then they talked about, okay, well, you were striking SK, so we're going to move you over to the MSU. So they moved me over to the MSU, and we have a meeting of non-rates with a female chief who was supposed to be our non-rate liaison. It's my first day. I go into this meeting, and she's sitting facing the wall, and I walk in through the back, and she turns around, and it is one of the people who put me in the Coast Guard. And she looks at me and she goes, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I promise you I'm not in trouble." She goes, "You better not be. We're going to have a conversation." I said, "Okay, Chief." So later on, she found me. And she said, "What's going on? Why are you here?" And I said, "Well, my XO and my CO at my checkout told me I'm not allowed to tell anybody down here what happened to me up there because they don't want it to follow me around." And she said, "Oh, hell no." When I had checked out up in PA, my XO and my CO, they said, "When you go down to Portland, we don't really want you to tell anybody what happened to you up here. We want you to have a fresh start. We don't want this to be on your back." And I said, "Oh, okay." Until I met Chief Cloud. I told her what had gone on. And that was my first moment of seeing that somebody who mattered cared for me. And she said, we're gonna help you. And she brought me into our CO's office, Captain Rob. Such a good man. And she said, "You don't have to tell him anything you don't want to, but just talk to him about what's going on." So I sat across from my captain, and I just told him everything. And he looked at me with tears rolling down his face, told me he had a daughter my age, and that he would do whatever he could to help me. And he did. And he fought, and he called people on the weekends. He called people up at headquarters. Chief Cloud fought for me. But to no avail. Nothing came from anything. And I came to base one day, and there was any Master Chief that you could possibly think of. My D13 Master Chief was there. My Sector Master Chief was there. There was probably 16 of them. And I get pulled into a room with my Sector Master Chief. Super cool dude. Sat me down, and he said, "Megan, I have heard your story. And I would really love to encourage you to stay in the Coast Guard. Because we need women like you who are willing to fight." And I said, "That's very nice of you, but I don't see myself continuing with a service that promised to protect me and isn't." He said, "Well, the Admiral of the West Coast heard your story and sent his Master Chief. We're not actually here for a base tour. We're here to hear your story." I said, "Okay." He goes, "We're going to have a meeting later." Okay. So later that afternoon, I get pulled into Chief's office with the Master Chief of D13, my Command Chief, my Station Chief. I think that's all who was allowed to be in there. D13 Master Chief sits there and he goes, you know, I really want to help you. And I was like, okay. He's like, but I read through your files and I read your investigation, and do you know that you weren't actually assaulted? You were just harassed. And I said, so you're telling me that somebody who touched me for over 3 months that I didn't want to, that's harassment to you? He goes, well, I'm just telling you what the investigation says and what they came up with. I said, well, excuse me, excuse my language, but that's bullshit. And he goes, well, I'm going to make it my due diligence to make sure that BM1 doesn't make chief. Oh, that's great. What are you going to do about the guy who assaulted me? Well, he's a contract worker. He's a civilian. My hands are tied. There's nothing I can do. And I sat there for a second and I looked at everybody in the room and they're just... And that's when I started to not care. And I looked at him and I said, what you are telling me is bullshit. It's not good enough for me. You're trying to smooth things over and it's not good enough for me. I said, this man has done it before. I'm just the first person to report him. And I said to the D13 Master Chief, I said, he's going to do it again. But the difference this time is it's going to be on your hands, Master Chief, and I hope that you can live with that. And he didn't have much to say after that because I wasn't letting up. I wasn't telling him what he wanted to hear, and I wasn't making him feel better about not knowing how to handle my situation. So he said, well, is there anything else that I can do for you? I said, you know what, Master Chief? There is something you can do for me. You can award me one of your challenge coins so I can show my father that I stuck up for myself. And he looked over at my command chief and he said, go get the one I gave to you. So my command chief went off and got the challenge coin that he was given from him. And gave it to the Master Chief, D13. And I sat there and I just went like this. And he said, no, you got to shake my hand. I said, oh, I do? And I grabbed the coin out of his palm. I said, you have a very nice afternoon, Master Chief. And I walked out. That was the time where I said, I'm not messing around anymore. What happened to me was wrong. And none of these people who are supposed to protect me are doing what they can to. And I realized that I was a stain on the command. And they were more worried about their careers than they were about helping me. Chief Cloud and I found out that my report actually never made it to the SARC's desk. They actually never even reported what the civilian had done to me. I found out that the command up in Port Angeles had pretty much shoveled as much as they could under the rug and hoped that I was going to keep my mouth shut. At this point, I was in a med board. I had been diagnosed with PTSD, exasperated by military service. So I was pretty much just working in Portland until my med board would drop. I got pregnant with my son. That's a whole other issue. But when I was about 7 or 8 months pregnant, I went in for an appointment. And my OB, when I walked in, she said, "That's not regular pregnancy pain." And I had brought my mom to the appointment, and we went in to the room, and she said, "Can I give you a pelvic exam?" I said, "Sure." At this point, I'd been in therapy, and I had felt that I had made big strides to better myself and feel better. And when she gave me my exam, she goes, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't notice this sooner." She said, "Have you ever been the victim of sexual assault?" And I said, "Yeah, I have." She goes, "I'm sorry, I never realized how much pain you were in." What had happened was that my body went on attack mode, like it was being attacked. And my brain's way of moving on from the trauma was to forget about it. So, I have no more pelvic floor anymore. So when I'm pregnant, my babies sit directly on my pelvis. And it's extremely painful. Knowing that the psychological damage that I had felt, and then knowing that there was physical damage, was a whole other thing. And I didn't find it out until weeks before I became a mother. I had my son, and I was still waiting for my med board to drop. Going to work every day in a place where you don't feel safe or heard, it was torture. I just wanted to be home with my son at that point. I remember rocking him in the morning. At that time, they only gave me 6 weeks at home with my baby. I remember rocking him before I went to work and just crying and going, "I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back. I'm finally safe." And it was just torture dropping my new baby off and having to go back into that environment. But I continued to fight. And I just wouldn't shut up. So a lot of people didn't like me. And I had just accepted that. If you gave me a job, I would work my butt off. I remember just trying to work the view away of what they had of me. Like, if I just worked really hard, they would know that I wasn't a piece of crap. I wanted to be somebody that was proud of their service. I had found out that my med board was about to come down the line, so my days were numbered. That's when I really checked out. We had an Admiral Gromlich, come to my base, and we had an all hands. And as most of you know, the only time you get to talk to an admiral is when they ask. So he got up in front of my base and was talking about his zero tolerance policy and how they were making big strides and it was just doing really well. And they had a case going on up in Seattle, and the longer they kept it open, the more they found out about it. And I'm pretty sure he was talking about my case, but he didn't know that I was sitting there. So at the end of his "we're doing so much good" spiel, he goes, "Does anybody have any questions, comments?" And I raised my hand, and he said, "Yes." Or he had just this nice smile on his face. I said, "Good afternoon, Admiral Gromlich, Seaman Klement." And his face dropped. I know he knew who I was. And I said, I want to talk to you about your zero tolerance policy. It's broken. I've been in an ongoing investigation for 2.5 years. And I don't know how you expect me to move on with my life. Nobody's called me. Nobody's checked in on me. And I was like, your system is just broken. And I'm not telling you for myself because I'm on my way out, but I'm telling you for every woman after me. And I said, oh, yeah, one more thing before I sit down, Admiral. Yeah, both these men are still working for you today. And there was about 65 people on my base. They were either really embarrassed by me or they were like giving me high fives and telling me to F the man. So, but I didn't care. They didn't care about me, so I stopped caring. And as soon as he was done with his all-hands meeting, his Master Chief beelined it towards me and this group of people. We want to see you in Command Chief's office. I said, okay, sure. So I go into this another meeting with these chiefs, and he goes, I am going to make it my #1 duty to keep you informed and to make sure that you know what's going on with your case and we see some form of justice. And I said, yeah, that's really nice of you to say. I said, but I know that's not going to happen. I don't think you're ever going to contact me. And I said, but that's very nice of you. And I left, and I never heard from him, not one time. And miraculously, my med board came through just weeks later. I left. I only checked out with the people that I checked out with my captain because I had nothing but respect for him. I knew that he fought really hard for me. And then I drove home with my baby to my husband, and I started my life over in a new town. It's been about 9-10 years since I've been out of the Coast Guard. I wish that leaving base that day, I would have been able to leave everything that had happened to me. But this has continued to affect my life, and I have had to consciously continue to work at my mental health. I ended up having to go into 2.5 years of internal physical therapy and desensitization. Anytime my husband touched me, I would completely swell. I couldn't enjoy sex for a very long time. Sometimes I still struggle. At times it's been hard, and I think it'll continue to be hard at times. But I continue, for the sake of my sons and my marriage, to work through the things that have happened to me. And I want people to know that they're not alone. And even when they feel like there's nobody there to listen, we have resources and people who are willing to listen. And anytime you want to give up, keep going, keep fighting. Because the only thing that has helped me sleep at night, I never saw justice. I never was kept informed about what was going on. But the only thing that's helped me sleep at night is knowing that I never stopped fighting for myself.
Thanks for listening to our storytellers. Narrative therapy is just one modality to help a person work through their trauma. I know that the stories can be difficult to listen to. However, it's tremendously therapeutic to take trauma from your brain, give it a voice, and then let it be heard. So I thank you for taking the time. Any opinions expressed by our storytellers are their own lived experiences. They're not representative of the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard's efforts currently to address sexual assault and sexual harassment in our service, or the U.S. government. Thank you.